this would be a few that I would like to thank. And I see many students here, so maybe I just mentioned that the lesson I learned is that you should work with people you like and that are nice. So if you do research with someone that's just famous, but actually they're not really nice and you don't really like them, it's a waste of time. So just change. Basically, I think it's a good lesson that I learned, and I think it's good to learn science from someone who's also quite a good person and approachable and who has the time to teach. Secondly, I think Thomas spoke about freedom, and he gave something very important, becoming somehow from not similar backgrounds. He's older, so he lived more in communism, but slightly older than me. But I come from Romania, he's from Estonia, so we had about 50 years of dictatorship. So we do appreciate freedom, and yes, it's important to be able to teach evolution, and it's a really important thing for people to be able to learn about, how people came around, and so we should definitely cherish that. And education, scientific education, is very important. Sorry, it's going to be quite a long prologue, but don't worry, you've already seen amazing things starting with a presentation lecture, so you don't really need to see that much. But yeah, I mean, I think scientific education is really important, and I've seen this kind of firsthand in my home country, Romania. That's about 20 million people, so that's what, as big as Mumbai, probably. When the pandemic hit and where maybe 50% of the population did not trust the vaccination. So I participated with many others to explain to people about genetics, and I just want to look at the clock, so I don't want to be too long. Okay. This talk is going to be quite basic, so apologies from my evolutionary geneticists colleagues that they probably know most of it, but since there's quite a few students and many people from an archaeological background, I just thought it's good to just give a broad overview of my interests and of this idea of human diversity and why we study human diversity. So I'm a biologist, and I started initially doing neuroscience and immunology, but then I met Thomas Iliescu, and I thought it's very interesting to use biology to study human diversity. And people spoke a lot about demography and how we came about and how we came out of Africa. And this is just part of a picture. It's already a known picture. But I was very interested when I was talking to many years ago, my PhD supervisor about this idea of human diversity, and I've always thought it's interesting. And then one day my wife would ask me, so why is it important? What's the use really? Why do you study human history and diversity? Who cares? And I think this is again a valid point, because people should do something useful. They should only explain why we do something. But I do think it's very important to understand our origins and our diversity. And we see this in India, and we see this in many other places where maybe there's discrimination and there's preconceptions. And if we understand ourselves better in our history and past, I think this is something very valuable actually for society. That was my other point. So I'm really interested in human diversity from an evolutionary perspective. So why are we different biologically? As many people already mentioned, that people went out of Africa and colonized many places. And my question was always, so what happens when people reach these new environments? And the answer is not simple. It's simple and complicated. They do adapt to the environment. They adapt to the temperature. They adapt it to the environment. They adapt it to new pathogens. They adapt it to new cultural conditions. So examples of traits that have adapted are like skin, eye, hair color. People adapted to high altitude. People adapted actually to cold environments. We have evidence for genetic adaptation. Probably immunity and pathogens, and we've been talking about coronavirus a lot. Probably pathogens are the biggest driver of our evolution. So they were the ones that really made us adapt, because humans reach new environments with new pathogens, and they did have to adapt. In other words, the ones with beneficial variants survived, and the ones with not beneficial variants didn't. When we started agriculture, our population density increased. When we had animals, all these instances made viruses to jump from animals to humans. So pathogens were probably the strongest force of selection. And then we had these cases of gene cultural coevolution. So the idea that we went to a place, then we started having cows. Then this was a cultural evolution of ours. That meant that when a mutation appeared that allowed us to digest milk in adulthood, that was very beneficial, and it was selected for, because having milk when others could not would give you an extra source of nutrition, extra source of water, and several other things. So I studied for many years skin color, and I think skin color is something that we talk a lot in India. And I forgot to say that I did my PhD here. I was here 10 years ago, not here, but in Hyderabad for 6 months, and it's almost like coming home in a way. Many people here are friends or colleagues from the CCMB or from other places of India who helped me with data collection. So it's very nice to be here. So skin color has adapted, is a result of adaptation. One explanation is a result of adaptation to UV radiation. And this is a very nice map to show you how different UV radiation is across the world. So already when you see that, you kind of think, so when people went from place to place, they did have to adapt. And skin color is determined by the amount and type of melanin. Melanin is a pigment, so if you have more melanin, you have a darker skin. If you have less melanin, you have a lighter skin. It doesn't do anything else, really. And the interesting bit is that skin color correlates very well with UVR levels across the world. So the skin color of a native population correlates well with UV, which suggests to us strongly that evolution of skin color was a result of natural selection. And there's probably been some sexual selection, and of course there could be neutral forces. But the natural selection one is the one very interesting to us, and it's probably a dual pressure. So people in the where there was very strong UVR needed very strong, very darker skin, so that their deeper skin layers would be protected, and the folates, which is a very critical molecule, would not be degraded. As people moved in latitude with less UV, they actually needed to synthesize vitamin D, and that was probably in conjunction with the start of agriculture, where we started having less vitamin D from the diet. So having less melanin in the skin means you can get more UVB in the melanocytes that help synthesize vitamin D. So that was the selection force for lighter skin color, or at least that's one of the explanations. Skin color is a polygenic trait, and it has a very high heritability value. And when I say polygenic, we have a few genes that we know are mainly involved in determining skin color, and we know them. But in the melanosome, there's about 100 or 200 proteins active that contribute to the melanin synthesis. So you actually have multiple ways to regulate skin color, like the melanin context, and probably at least 100 genes are involved in this phenotype. And we've been talking, or you heard already, about this polymorphism in the SLC24A5 gene that explains maybe 30% of the variation between Europeans and Africans. And it's very interesting to see that this polymorphism, the one that often gives lighter skin, is absent in East Asians. So although East Asians are lighter skin, that was coming through convergent evolution. So they evolved lighter skin through a different genetic mechanism. And we're now starting to see some genes that are responsible for that. Actually, lighter skin was probably happened at least 3 times individually, because probably Neanderthals also had lighter skin, although we're not very sure anymore. And then East Asians and Europeans. So at least 2, maybe 3 events of lighter skin color evolution. So when I met Thomas, he had this project in India, and he said, maybe you could study skin color in India. And I was like, that's exactly what I always thought I would like to do in my life. I thought that's perfect. So I went to India, and the question was in India, actually, why is it so diverse in terms of skin color? So in terms of skin color, and I'll show you then some graphs. In Europe, we have very low variation compared to what we have in India. And this is a very legitimate question. How can we explain this diversity from a biological point of view, and what are the selective forces that have been active in shaping this diversity? And it's interesting in India because you have this very high diversity, you have also this endogamy, so this very unique population structure. So in this context, it's not a perfect place, but almost a perfect place from an evolutionary perspective to try to study a visual phenotype like skin color. And it's very exciting. So 10 years ago already, I'm getting older, I will be 40 soon, that's very depressing. 10 years ago, I was in Hyderabad for 6 months, and I collected data from maybe more than 1,000 people. So this is a derma spectrometer. It's a very simple machine. You put it on the skin, it sends a light, and you see there is skin reflectors, and it gives you basically a melanin index. And in Europe, we might range between 25 and 40. In Africa, we're looking at range maybe between 60 and 90, 100. In India, you have almost a range from European to African, so from 28 to 80 to 85. So India has this very big range in terms of skin color diversity. And in addition to this data, we had colleagues that had collected like saliva data, so we could look at frequency of some SNPs, like SL245, in different populations. So this shows you, and that was very interesting for us at that time. These are just a few populations from Andhra Pradesh, and this shows you what diversity you have in even similar populations. And these are not all of these, by the way. They're just actually the reddish, so very similar populations. And you had a range from 30 to 65 melanin index, so almost from a European towards an African in one population in one place without recent admixture. And for us, that was very interesting because we don't see this in Europe. Yeah, that was very interesting. One of the really interesting findings, and somehow everyone knew this in India, but no one had studied it. As I told you, around at the global level, you have this correlation between UV and skin color, which suggests that natural selection, so the response to the UV radiation, was the major force. Well, actually, you don't see this in India. And this is something, if you would ask anyone, they will say, you don't need to come from Cambridge to tell us that. Because we have lighter skin populations in the south, and we also have very dark skin populations in the north. But it was interesting for us to actually show it. So this is the level of UV measured in different places from different, each of this is a population, and this is the melanin index average of a population. And there's no real correlation between there's no real correlation between UV and skin color, whereas at the global level you have an 80% correlation. So that was very interesting, and with other data that we had, it suggested, our suggestion at least, was that in India, rather than natural selection forces, the social selection forces or sexual selection were more important. So different preferences in different populations from different skin colors led to this diversity within and between populations. At least that's one of the explanations. So that was one of our results, and we're hoping to pursue this further, and we're trying now to do more studies. And I think Thomas already showed that. And then if you look at the frequency of SLC2485 light skin allele, it's interesting that in India, it's a very complex pattern, so the overall frequency is about 50%, but you have populations that have 0%, and you have populations that have 100%. And you probably have populations even in vicinity, that have very different frequencies, and that's because it is high endogamy for at least a few thousand years that allowed this to happen. Something else that you find that is very interesting in India is these are two populations from the north, from like near neighboring states, and you can see how different their skin color range is. So one is basically from 30 to 50, and one is from like 40 to 80. And interestingly enough, and this is something we might try to do to look further in the future, this population that's very darker skin had also quite a high frequency of the, let's call it light skin European SLC2485 gene. So in that population, at least, you had individuals that were homozygous for the European allele, but they had very dark skin color. In other words, there's probably epistous, so there's other genes that override the effect of this one in like Indian genetic variant that we don't know of yet. And that leads us to think, how long do I have? Am I take right? Yeah? Okay, I'm confused. Okay, that's good. To be relaxed with India. So that's very interesting. First of all, from a forensical point of view, because if you would find this individual that is homozygous for the European allele, you would say it's a light-skinned individual. If you find the bone of this individual, but it's actually not. So from a forensic, it's interesting to think that actually complex phenotypes, you can have different genes in different populations that lead to different phenotypes. And so these kind of, for complex phenotypes, we should not always jump to conclusions. And another good example is in the Solomon Islands. So this is blonde hair genetic variant from the Solomon Islands. This is not because of Europeans. This is a variant that appeared in the Solomon Islands, and it's completely different variant than the one that gives blonde hair in Europe. So the point is that some phenotypes are complex, and we should always be careful when we analyze. And I think this is very interesting when we talk these days. I think in America there's parents that use polygenic scores to choose kind of almost designer babies when they have in vitro fertilization. So polygenic scores are getting better, but we're still having to learn a lot to learn about from the complexity of some of the phenotypes and the genes in different populations that give different outcomes. So that was just a broad overview of what I did many years ago. And these days I'm having fun with something slightly different, but kind of going back to origins, which is India in my case. So I'm very interested these days in the Roma minority population from Europe, which is, they're called more colloquially gypsies, but the correct term would be the Roma or the Romani population. And they're a population that has probably, that came from South Asia, starting with maybe about 1,000 years ago, that traveled. They're a population that was always, in a way, discriminated and outside the system in Europe, probably being semi-slaves until maybe 100 years ago. And they're very interesting and they're very diverse. And for us, it makes us ask some very interesting questions regarding admixture. And I think many years now I've been thinking about, and when we talk about human diversity, I think it's always about admixture. So we all mix at some point. In India, the admixture happened some thousands of years ago. In their case, the admixture with the Europeans happened in the last 1,000 years. In the Americas, it happened in the last 500 years. And then if you look at any population, you have these population components at different time scales. And my big question is always about the phenotypes. What happens to the adaptation in terms of skin color or immunity? What happens when these populations meet? How do they take advantageous variants one from the other? And these days I'm trying to study the Roma gypsies in Romania, which is not very easy to do. And trying to understand this evolutionary history, but more importantly, in the phenotypical history. So I'm very interested in skin color, but also immunity and vitamin D. And I'll just talk very briefly about that. And they're very diverse. So these are some ladies in a traditional costume. Those are some very famous gypsy musicians from Romania. And these are some kids. And they can look very different, and they're almost different castes within the Romani populations in Europe. And it's very interesting because we don't know much about their genetics, and it's always important to know the genetics of minorities. So one example was, for example, with COVID. In the UK, they actually have very good public record data, and they could take data when COVID was there. And actually, in what we saw in the UK was that South Asians were predisposed to severe COVID because of some genetic variants. And it's interesting from a perspective of someone that comes from Romania. By the way, Romania is a small country in Eastern Europe, and you probably haven't heard of it. But it's slightly bigger than Estonia, actually considerably bigger than Estonia. just as a matter of fact. Yeah. But much smaller than India, so it's okay. But what's very interesting to me, for example, is that there was discussion in the UK about how different minorities reacted to COVID and if they were more effective. There was not much discussion in Romania or in Europe about the Romas because we don't know much about their genetic architecture. And no one has studied, for example, if they died more of COVID, which I think would be something very interesting to see, if they carry some different variants. So the point is, if you manage to get to understand the genetics of some of the minority populations, could be very beneficial. One example, and that was an interesting study from maybe 10 years ago, was that what was a study that looked at how humans adapted to plague. That was, let's say, a more basic study, but it was nevertheless interesting because what it did, that study looked at recent adaptation in some toll-like, in some receptors that we think are involved in the response to bacterial infection. And the way they did it was to compare some Europeans with Romas and with Indians. And they found some genetic variants that were changed only in Romas and in Europeans, not in Indians. The idea being that those had been changed in the last 600-700 years when the Romas were already in Europe, maybe as a response to plague. So this idea of recent adaptation and how admixed populations like the Romas responded to different challenges is something that I'm trying to study now and to compare it to Indians that are also mixed but at a different level. So that's in a nutshell. And one way we're trying to do this, and for this we're trying to get blood. And it's not easy to get blood from Roma population because they're literally superstitious, and in general they don't trust someone European like me, like someone, yeah. Is to actually look at immune phenotypes, and this is something we're going to try to do in conjunction with measuring skin color, which is basically, you can't really infect people in a population to see how they respond. It's not very ethical. But you can take blood from someone and in a dish you can put bacteria or fungi and see how, and then measure the cytokine response. So you can basically measure the immune response of the population. And this is something we're trying to do in different populations in a more anthropological context with the people who did this study, and they had done it in a more medical context. Okay. And why I'm looking at immunity as well is that we think there's a connection, and we know there's a connection between vitamin D immunity and skin color. And for example, in the Romani population in Europe, that they're darker skinned, we think, and no one has looked yet, that there's probably quite high vitamin D deficiency. And we're trying to understand this thing. And in other words, what we're trying to do now, and with colleagues like Dr. Niraj, right, is to compare the different evolutionary forces. The idea being that in Europe, probably natural selection was the prevalent force, and in India, was the social selection was the more prevalent force. And this is something we're trying to do. And this is just the last slide, I think. Yeah. This is something I've done recently in a cohort in Poland to kind of look at this vitamin D. And this was very interesting. I mean, it's kind of basic from a genetic, because it's not genetic data, but that was basically melanin index data and vitamin D data. And these are boys and these are girls. And these are just the boys here, and this is autumn. These are measurements in autumn, and these are measurements in spring. And what we see in places like Poland, where actually people are very light skinned. So the range here is 24 to 36 melanin index. So they're very. But even within this range, we see a response to vitamin D based on depending on the melanin index. So this kind of tells us that it tells us that vitamin D was probably a strong evolutionary force if we see this kind of pattern even in a very light-skinned population. And this is something we're trying to explore in mixed populations from Romania, like the Romani. And that's it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Please, questions?
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. As a biological, anthropological point of view, I have two specific questions. As you mentioned, that number one is that the skin color is a very complex trait. So that's why there is genetic factor, and another is the environmental stresses. Do you think the environmental stresses is the only factor for the variation of skin color, as India is the greatest melting pot of different castes, tribes, everything?
So when you mean environmental, you mean what?
There's two factors. Number one is the genetic factor and the environment factor. The environmental stresses is one of the factor of the environmental factor. The stress, it can change as because India is the biggest melting pot of different castes, tribes, and everyone. That you mentioned. And number two question is, you have considered the population. In our lab, we have started kind of work in a very small manner. We have taken the endogamous group, like the tribals of eastern and northeastern populations, and there is, as because they are the closely endogamous population, so we can control the genetic factor. So it is possible to identify the environmental stresses, how it is changing. And in case of the heterogeneous in nature, the caste population, how it is possible, how we can control this factor. So this is my specific question. What is your opinion? Is a curiosity from as an anthropologist. Thank you very much.
I understand, because I already almost forgot the first question, but it's about genetic and environmental. Basically, we mainly look at when we say genetic, we mainly look at the genetic because we measure from a non-tan area. So when you mean environment, you mean how people responded within evolution to the environment, right? So probably in India, there was, of course, a response to the environment as well. I mean, there is sun here, and there is. So it's not like the natural selection does not exist. It's just that in India, probably the social forces, since there is enough sun, so vitamin D is not an issue.
The heterogeneity factor is very important here. It's because the most of the tribal heterogeneity, the most of the caste populations, they are heterogeneous in nature. But the tribals, they are the close population, very small population, and endogamous in nature. This factor is very important. So what is your opinion?
So basically, diversity we have now is also the result endogamy, and we have data from all the articles of Collis and what Professor Tangaraj and David Wright, and they've looked at it. Endogamy has ensued in the last 2,000 years. So before that, or 3,000, there was mixture around. So that the diversity we see today is because there was this happy, like, how did Thomas say, make love, not, there was love made between populations, basically, right? Yes, the society was different, let's say, right? When endogamy ensued, then I think we get this very interesting pattern about differences between populations. But the overall diversity, which is quite amazing in India, is probably the result of different waves of populations before admixture. So, for example, in the case of SLC2485, and I had this discussion, discussing with Miraj, and I discussed with other colleagues, having studied it in India, and we would like more data, and we like ancient data, of course, and that would be the next step. I would guess that there's been at least 2 instances of SLC coming to India. That would be my guess. Whereas the lactose one is more restricted, and it's only 10% frequency, and it's probably coming later. When you look at the SLC frequency and how it's distributed, it might have been coming with the agriculture population, and might have been coming with, you talk a lot about STEM these days, so I would guess there's at least 2 instances, so it's quite complex, basically. Then endogamy happens, and then each population goes in a way, its own way. And that's what we're trying to look now, and we have an interesting study actually ongoing, looking at, because we know some populations have more preferences for lighter skin, that's the issue here. It's something we talk about because it's important to talk about and to say that this is not right, but that's how it is. But this preference is different between populations. And we have there's a data set of matrimonial data from across India online, where you can see what people prefer and what they want. And we would like to correlate that with some melanin-based data and some homozygous genetic data from some skin color genes. So we're trying to look at this. But it's fascinating nevertheless. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's someone there.
Now you spoke. Hello. You spoke about your next step as we will be studying the ancient genome to correlate with skin color.
Not me, some colleagues. It's too complicated.
Okay.
Yeah,
No, I thought it was you. But my question would be a general one, because if they find that the selection was already there previously, before this 5,000 years, in those ancient samples, then the whole narrative of selection happened in the last 3,000-4,000 years would change, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, selection probably, so I think my article with Chandana, our article, the suggestion was that the origin of the gene, of this gene, was even 25,000 years ago, and probably selection started later. Of course, we don't know about this 25. But actually, because we find it in the Zagros mountains in the Iran, we find it in samples 10,000 years old. It's pretty consistent that it might have been even older, the mutation, and that selection started later, basically. So selection probably happened before. The idea, for example, for light skin, for fair skin, we find it in the Vedas as well. There's some mentions. I mean, we looked at that because we were curious to see. So we don't know exactly, as there were populations that preferred darker skin, we have all sorts of very interesting ethnographic and like books about it. I think Marco Polo in his book talks about the population in India. So there's all sorts of very interesting things here happening. We're just trying to talk and explain that this skin color is some genes, basically, that they don't do anything. They don't make you really smarter. On the contrary, you might have chances to be, but I'm joking. But basically, these are some genes, and they're a result of environmental plus and social forces.
Something like skin cancer.
Yes.
Risk of skin cancer.
Yes.
For people from West.
Yes. 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 So I can't live for too long in India, basically. Yeah, I mean, skin cancer is a very interesting one. It's been suggested that it's not an evolutionary factor because you get it later in life, but it's not sure. It's very obvious that Europeans who went to Australia and didn't use too much sun cream got a lot of skin cancer. So that's here the very few, and we know that variants that make you whiter. For example, I'm white. I also have, as we joke in Romania, a little bit of more. No, I'm quite white actually, but people who are even whiter or very reddish, they have the genes, the skin color gene that predispose them also to skin cancer. We know that. Yeah.
Do we have a critical
For the what for?
The Vedic references you are saying, Vedic, the actual references, the preferences of the white, the bone color, in the early stages of the ancient selection.
The ancient one.
Yeah.
It's something I think we cite in our paper, my paper on skin color from American Journal of Human Biology. I think we give a reference, an old reference where this is mentioned. Yeah. Can I go away? No. Okay, no.
You have to stay on stage now. I would like to thank you for this engrossing lecture and for acquainting us with the diversity that the modern human DNA harbors. I would like to call our session chair to present the memento to Dr. Iliescu. Next, I would like to invite Professor Sultana and Dr. Bharadwaj to please come up on stage and present the memento to our session chair.